It's a strange thing what a mother can kill in her own child. I spent 32 years running from the gilded lies of my family, carving out a self-made life in Denver, fueled by grit and caffeine, all for my daughter June. My name is Emily Taylor, and I thought I'd finally broken free of the Vance dynasty's toxic grip. But when the Christmas invitation arrived, a summons back to the snow-covered, silent judgment of the Aspen estate, it wasn't for reconciliation. It was a calculated trap designed to humiliate June and finalize my financial exile. When my own mother looked my 11-year-old in the eye and said, "You are not my true blood," the choice became brutally clear: continue running or burn her pristine world to the ground. What would you do when dignity is the only inheritance you have left to fight for? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. I once heard that success is the best revenge. If that were true, my tiny windowless office in downtown Denver was a fortress. At 32, I was Emily Taylor, sole proprietor of a small but viciously effective property law practice. My life was built on two things: caffeine and the fierce determination to be nothing like my mother. Right now, I was trying to draft a counterclaim against a city planning board, a bureaucratic beast I planned to slay by midnight. The fluorescent light hummed, smelling of stale coffee and printer toner, and I loved every chaotic second of it. This was personal freedom paid for in all-nighters, not trust funds. My daughter June was the why of it all. At 11, she was a whirlwind of bright energy and startling intelligence. Everything I fought for, the long hours, the relentless focus, the absolute refusal to buckle, was for her secure future. She was my anchor, and she was the one thing my mother, Eleanor Vance, had never managed to truly touch. Then the envelope arrived. It was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with the family crest, a grotesque gilded bird. Inside was an invitation to spend Christmas at the Vance estate in Aspen. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons cloaked in the false warmth of obligation. Eleanor never called unless it was to criticize, so this sudden outreach was a flare in the dark, signaling an ambush. I should have shredded it instantly. I should have called my best friend, poured a glass of cheap wine, and laughed it off. But before I could, June bounded into the office, her eyes snagging on the ornate card. "Mom, is this it?" she whispered, her voice tight with a hope I hadn't realized she still carried. "A real Christmas, with a giant tree and everything." I watched her face, the way her lips trembled with anticipation, and felt a familiar, corrosive ache. June had only known my small, hard-working life. She yearned for the traditional, glittering family fantasy, the kind I knew was a gilded lie. My own childhood with Eleanor had been defined by conditional love, thinly veiled contempt, and the constant reminder that I was the disappointing second child, a shadow to my golden older brother, Marcus Vance. When I divorced, Eleanor had framed it as a shameful defection from the family legacy. I ran to Denver and started over, determined to sever the tie. But watching June now, her entire small body vibrating with innocent possibility, I faltered. I couldn't crush her dream of belonging. My instincts screamed danger, but her hope was a silent, compelling argument I couldn't beat. I called Chloe, Marcus's wife. She was the only remaining link, a casualty of Eleanor's coldness, who had found a way to survive within the walls. Her voice was flat, devoid of Christmas cheer. "She's doing it, Em. The lawyers were at the house last week. She's finalizing the papers. This is not a holiday. Be a lawyer, not a daughter." The warning was all the confirmation I needed. Eleanor wasn't inviting us for Christmas. She was inviting us to witness her final legal act of eradication. I tucked the invitation into my briefcase right next to the city planning litigation file. The trip was no longer a family visit. It was a defensive maneuver, a necessary reconnaissance. If Eleanor wanted a game, she was going to play against an opponent she thought she had already eliminated. I packed a few clothes for June and me, but the bulk of my luggage was my laptop, legal pads, and evidence files. As June loaded her favorite snow globe into the car, I pulled on my worn leather gloves. I looked at the Vance crest one last time. It was a promise of wealth and power, but to me it was the iron stamp of control. I wouldn't let her control me anymore. The drive was long, winding, and beautiful, the picturesque snow-dusted mountains of Colorado giving way to the exclusive remote luxury of Aspen. June chattered relentlessly, dreaming aloud about cousins and sleigh rides, her voice a fragile shield against the cold certainty settling in my stomach. As we finally turned off the highway onto the long, privately plowed driveway, the Vance estate rose up a vast timber and stone fortress, blazing with enough imported lights to power my entire Denver office block. The sight was sickeningly beautiful. I took a deep, centering breath. I checked the lock on my briefcase. "Ready, June Bug?" I asked. She nodded, eyes wide with the spectacle. I put the car in park and narrated the new reality in my head. The only way I could handle it, I was no longer driving toward a holiday. I was driving toward an execution, and I was going to be the defense counsel. I was Taylor the counsel, and this was my opening argument. The air inside the Vance estate wasn't warm. It was chilled, expensive, and heavy with unspoken history. Stepping across the threshold was like walking onto a stage set for a tragedy I'd already read the script for. Eleanor's greeting was a performance. She swooped toward June first, her lips brushing the air near my daughter's cheek. "June, darling, you've grown so much taller. Are you taking piano lessons yet?" Such a talented family. It was praise designed not to uplift June, but to highlight my own failure to provide the proper upbringing. When her gaze finally settled on me, it was cold. "Emily, you look tired. I do hope you've allowed yourself a break from the daily grind." The implication hung there. The daily grind being the self-made life I'd built, which was apparently an insult to the Vance name. The immediate hostility was subtle yet pervasive. My father George offered a brusque nod, his eyes already drifting away, confirming his role as the eternal silent enabler. My brother Marcus, the golden child, shook my hand with the distant formality of a business associate, a man too busy being important to be a brother. He was already enjoying the fruits of the legacy, while I was an inconvenient reminder of the family's messiness. Isolation tactics were in full effect at the Christmas Eve brunch. The table was vast, gleaming mahogany. When we approached, I noticed the place settings were meticulous. Eleanor, George, Marcus, Chloe, and their 2 children, my niece and nephew. There were no cards for June or me. When I gestured to the empty spaces, Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, we thought you might prefer the sunroom, Emily. It's lovely and quiet for you to catch up on your things. And June, well, she can sit with the younger ones later for a special dessert." It was public humiliation disguised as consideration. We were not at the table of power, we were relegated to the margins. I felt a familiar, sickening nausea, but I gripped June's hand tight, offering a forced, neutral smile. I was here as counsel, and I would not give the opposition an emotional reaction. Eleanor launched her targeted psychological strikes throughout the afternoon. When June proudly showed off a drawing, Eleanor praised my niece's perfectly composed oil painting instead. When Marcus mentioned a lucrative land deal he'd finalized, Eleanor sighed dramatically. Unlike poor Emily, who insists on wading into the muck of small claims insurance fraud. Such a pity, all that potential. The comparisons were relentless, designed to erode my sense of professional worth and validate her narrative that I was incompetent to raise my child or manage my life. Every word was a calculated weapon. The escalation of the psychological warfare reached a new peak after lunch. June, still reeling from the earlier snubs, was desperate to please. She approached Eleanor with a handmade wooden charm bracelet she'd spent weeks crafting. Eleanor took it, examined it with the tip of one finger, and placed it on a side table. "That's sweet, dear, but I really only wear precious metals. Perhaps your cousin could find a more suitable home for it." June's small shoulders slumped. The light in her eyes flickered, replaced by confusion and deep hurt. This was the moment I realized I wasn't fighting for property rights. I was fighting for my daughter's soul. Then came the professional trap. My phone vibrating relentlessly in my coat pocket finally caught my attention. It was my partner. The opposition in the high-profile property litigation case, the one involving a key parcel of Aspen land, and ironically a philanthropic foundation Eleanor supported, had sprung an emergency filing. If I didn't draft a complex response citing 3 specific case precedents and file it before the end of the business day, my client would be ruined. I was professionally chained to my phone. The timing was not bad luck. It felt orchestrated. Eleanor, with her vast network of contacts, could have easily monitored the case's movements. My heart sank. I knew leaving June exposed was exactly what Eleanor wanted. This crisis validated her narrative that I always prioritized work over family, while simultaneously giving her unsupervised access to June. I approached Eleanor, keeping my voice level. "I have an emergency filing. I have to step out for a few hours. I'll take a car to a quiet library downtown." Eleanor's smile was a masterpiece of cold, self-satisfied benevolence. The calculated exposure is necessary, I suppose. Such a pity to disrupt Christmas. "Don't worry, darling. I'll supervise June." The word supervise was a venomous dart. It wasn't reassurance. It was a clear sign of impending dismissal and emotional abuse. My father George looked away. My brother Marcus just shrugged, absorbed in his own importance. I knelt and hugged June tightly, kissing her forehead. "I have to fight a dragon, sweetie. Be brave. I'll be back as fast as I can." She nodded, her eyes wide but brave. I left the Vance estate with dread clawing at me, feeling the heavy, sickening weight of having abandoned my defense post. I found a sterile, brightly lit executive office center downtown, a fortress of fluorescent lighting and anonymity. I opened my laptop and plunged into the legal jargon, adrenaline fueling my focus. I was drafting a motion that would save my client from financial devastation, a victory for American diligence, and legal precedent. But the fight felt hollow, disconnected from the battle raging back at the estate. The hours bled together. The clock was ticking toward the filing deadline. I was elbow-deep in property statutes when my phone vibrated with a single devastating text from June. It wasn't a question about presents or dinner. It was the first message of total psychological warfare. "Grandma told the cousins my dad is a nobody. Why did she say that?" The words were like a physical blow. They weren't just cruel, they were strategically targeted at the weakest point of a child's identity. The war had begun, and I was miles away, paralyzed by my own professional obligations. I tried to type a soothing response, but my fingers were numb. I couldn't move. The deadline was 20 minutes away, and if I didn't finish, a different client would be ruined. The pressure was suffocating. I realized I had not just miscalculated Eleanor's cruelty, I had underestimated her strategic reach. She used my dedication to my career, my self-made resilience as the perfect weapon to isolate and wound my daughter. I finished the document, signed it electronically, and hit send. The law was satisfied. But the professional victory tasted like ash. I slammed my laptop shut, adrenaline spiking into pure rage. My client was saved, but my child was under attack. I was no longer concerned with property lines or precedent. My heart beat a single ferocious rhythm, June. The conclusion was instant and primal. The law could wait. My daughter could not. And neither could the reckoning. I grabbed my coat and ran. I pushed the luxury sedan to its limit on the icy mountain road, the tires fighting for purchase. My mind raced no longer on property law, but on a single searing image: June hurt and alone. The legal motions and deadlines vanished. All that existed was the sickening knowledge that I had been played my duty, used as a means to expose my daughter to Eleanor's cold malice. The 20-minute drive felt like an hour, every dark bend in the road a barrier keeping me from my child. I cursed the professional integrity that had chained me to a desk while my mother executed her psychological strike. The return to silence at the Vance estate was the first sign of the true horror. The house, blazing with holiday cheer when I'd left, now felt menacingly still. I didn't use the front door. I slipped through the back entrance near the kitchen, moving like a ghost. The sound of clinking silverware and forced laughter drifted from the main dining room. I heard Marcus's loud, hearty chuckle, then Eleanor's sharp, dry voice. A perfect end to a perfect day. They were celebrating, and I was missing. I rushed past the grand staircase and toward the quietest part of the second floor. I found June curled up in the rarely used library, a small dark room near the back of the house. The sight of her broke me. She wasn't just disappointed, she was shattered. She was clutching a piece of velvet ribbon, the red color a painful contrast to her tear-stained cheeks. The discovery of the wound came with the sound of her broken sobs. I knelt, wrapping my arms around her. June Bug, I'm so sorry. I'm here now. She buried her face against my shoulder, trembling. Through hiccuped breaths, she managed to recount the incident. She had gone to show Eleanor the bracelet she'd finished. Eleanor had sat her down on a velvet bench, leaning close, a gesture of false intimacy, and whispered the words I would never forget. You are not my true blood, Juniper. You are only a problem. Get out of my sight before I lose my temper. Eleanor hadn't shouted. She hadn't even been overtly angry. She had delivered the wound with the surgical precision of a sociopath, using the quiet venom that only an insecure matriarch can muster. She had sought to invalidate June's very existence, to brand her as genetically and socially inferior, a liability. The pain I felt was blinding, a primal red-hot rage that was almost impossible to contain. But somewhere in that white-hot fury, the cold, clinical voice of the lawyer kicked in. I was no longer a distraught mother. I was Emily Taylor, the counsel, and this was the defense of my client's future. The transformation was instant. Emotion was a weakness Eleanor counted on. Proof was the only language she understood. I gently moved June back a few inches. My voice was steady, shockingly calm. June, honey, I need you to be the bravest girl in the world for me right now. Can you tell me exactly what Grandma said, just one more time? I pulled out my phone, activated the video recorder, and held it low out of sight, but focused on her small, trembling face. This was the smoking gun, the essential piece of irrefutable proof. June, confused but trusting, recounted the scene again. Her small voice, thick with tears, detailing the calculated cruelty of her grandmother, was captured forever. The audio and visual evidence shifted the entire dynamic of the conflict from subjective trauma to objective documented malice. This piece of digital evidence was a moral contract, the proof I needed that no one could twist, deny, or dismiss as a misunderstanding. After the recording ended, I held June close for a long moment, allowing myself only a minute to absorb her pain and refill my internal reservoir of resolve. Then I stood. The confrontation had to happen now, while the evidence was fresh and the family was gathered. I led June out of the library, her small hand trembling in mine. We walked toward the dining room, past the marble halls and the sickeningly perfect decorations. We were two against a dynasty. As we neared the dining room, a figure materialized in the hallway, Chloe Vance, Marcus's wife. She looked pale, her eyes wide with fear and a terrible familiar sympathy. This was the moment of covert aid. She didn't speak. As we passed, she pressed a plain white envelope into my hand, her fingers lingering for a brief second in a silent plea. Take it. Use it. I didn't stop or react. I slid the envelope into the deep pocket of my wool coat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew without looking that it wasn't a Christmas card. We stepped into the dining room. The sight was surreal. Silverware clinked against fine china. The entire family, Eleanor, George, Marcus, Chloe, the cousins, sat at the massive mahogany table, bathed in the soft light of the chandelier. Laughter and conversation instantly died. The dining room bomb was about to detonate. Eleanor recovered first, lifting her chin with a dismissive air. Emily, you decided to rejoin us. Do try to control your work schedule. We were just discussing your daughter's need for better social instruction. She needs to learn manners. Her voice was designed to be casual, turning the cruelty into a justified lesson. I ignored her words. I walked straight to the table, stood tall, and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady. I tapped play. June's fragile, hiccuping voice filled the opulent room, amplified by the phone's speaker. Grandma said I'm not her true blood Juniper. You are only a problem. Get out of my sight. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Marcus froze his fork halfway to his mouth. George dropped his gaze to his plate, his face coloring with shame. The cousins looked confused, then deeply uncomfortable. Eleanor, however, remained still, her face a mask of incandescent fury, attempting to glare my daughter's voice into silence. The tape continued June's full, sorrowful account, finishing the final line. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice shaking with controlled rage. How dare you! That is a manipulative, edited farce. I was simply correcting her ill-mannered behavior. She attempted to salvage control, but the damage was done. My focus then turned to the coat pocket. As the family watched, I slowly pulled out the plain white envelope Chloe had given me. This was the document reveal. I didn't open it fully. I just let the top edge of the photocopied paper show enough to see the letterhead and a few keywords. It was the Vance Trust codicil. The document was dated 3 weeks prior and clearly outlined the revocation of my fractional share of the family estate and its consolidation entirely under Marcus's portion. I was legally and completely disinherited. The Christmas invitation wasn't a lure, it was an insult. Eleanor wanted me to be present to feel the final cold sting of papers I couldn't challenge. I looked directly at Eleanor, bypassing the smokescreen of her anger. This isn't about manners, Mother. This is about malice. The cruelty was calculated and the disinheritance was premeditated. Eleanor's mask finally shattered. Her face contorted, her breath catching in her throat. She slammed her hand onto the table, rattling the crystal. Walk out that door, Emily. Walk out that door and the Vance name will erase you. I gripped June's hand, the familiar coldness of the estate dissolving into a clear, single purpose. I had the evidence of emotional cruelty and the evidence of financial malice. I had both the moral ammunition and the legal documentation. My mind raced through the implications. I had the video, the undeniable truth of a child's betrayal. I had the codicil, the proof of Eleanor's ultimate goal. This was not a random fight. It was the final stand against a lifetime of psychological control. I looked at June, whose small body was trembling, but whose eyes were fixed on mine with absolute trust. I would not let her down again. I looked back at Eleanor, not with filial respect, but with the cold, focused intensity of an adversary. I had the evidence. I had the motive. And I had finally found the fire I needed to burn the whole thing down. I grabbed June, pulling her away from the tableau of horror and shame, and marched her out of the dining room. Eleanor's final enraged words, "The Vance name will erase you," were a promise I intended to turn into a lie. We didn't stop for coats. We simply got in the car, leaving the glittering facade of the estate behind. The drive down the mountain was silent, punctuated only by June's occasional hiccup. She was huddled against the passenger door, exhausted. My hands, still steady on the wheel, were cold with a focused, surgical calm. I was no longer driven by rage. I was driven by strategy. Safe in a sterile, brightly lit hotel room in downtown Denver, after tucking a sleeping June into a king-sized bed, I finally addressed the final piece of the puzzle, the envelope from Chloe. I pulled out the photocopies and spread them on the desk. This was the document, reveal the Vance Trust codicil, dated just before the Christmas invitation was sent. It was even more extensive than I'd feared. It wasn't just my portion that was revoked. The entire structure was shifted to shield the principal assets from any potential claim, consolidating everything real estate, liquid assets, and controlling interests under Marcus. Eleanor had set him up as the dynasty's sole heir, effectively erasing me and June from the family's financial future. I realized then that the Christmas cruelty was not the point. It was the veneer. The humiliation was the secondary pleasure Eleanor had indulged in, a triumphant flourish to accompany the true weapon, the financial and legal elimination of my family unit. Her cruelty was calculated, designed to inflict maximum emotional damage, just as she secured her legal victory. She had wanted me to be a powerless, weeping witness. My initial plan to challenge the codicil based on undue influence felt too slow and messy. Eleanor was protected by layers of expensive lawyers. The fight for the inheritance would take years, tying up both my energy and my sanity. I looked at June sleeping peacefully and knew I had to secure her future now. My focus shifted immediately to the strategic retreat and the true target, Eleanor's prestige. Her power wasn't in her wealth alone, it was in her image. Her social standing, her moral authority, was her shield. I knew exactly where to strike. I opened my laptop and pulled up the articles of incorporation for the Aspen Charitable Trust. This was Eleanor's cornerstone, the foundation she chaired, built entirely on a self-promoted image of family values and moral stewardship. This was where her power resided, in the judgment of her wealthy peers. If I could destroy that image, I would dismantle her power structure instantly, leaving her without her greatest defense. The goal was no longer the messy property fight. It was a strategic annihilation of her public persona. I called my legal partner, rousing him from his Christmas morning. He was initially skeptical, seeing only the complication of a family feud. I cut him short, sending him the file containing two key pieces of evidence. 1. The codicil proof of financial malice and premeditation, and 2. The video recording of June's confession, irrefutable evidence of emotional cruelty. This is not a feud, I told him. This is a targeted legal complaint based on moral turpitude and calculated fraud aimed at the moral foundation she uses to justify her power. He went silent upon watching the video. The combination of the child's voice and the stark legal document was a devastating 1-2 punch. My partner agreed this was an immediate PR and legal disaster for Eleanor. We drafted a formal legal complaint, not to sue for the estate yet, but to report her behavior and the financial manipulation to the Board of Governors. The complaint cited the trust's own moral governance clauses and attached the evidence. I worked through the rest of the night. As the first light of Christmas morning filtered through the hotel blinds, I prepared for the information drop. I wasn't going to let Eleanor control the narrative. I sent the complete package, the legal complaint, the codicil, and the link to the video file simultaneously to 3 key groups. 1. The Foundation's Board of Governors, to force an immediate internal investigation and a crisis of leadership. 2. Their top 3 local donors, to hit her where it hurt her funding and influence network. 3. The Aspen Daily News and 2 other major Denver papers, to ensure the speed and scale of the public exposure were overwhelming. I hit send. It was a unilateral declaration of war, a choice of personal freedom over silent obedience. I was no longer waiting for justice, I was creating it. I was fighting fire with a digital inferno. I zipped up my coat, my hands shaking from the sheer adrenaline, not from fear. I looked out the hotel window at the snow falling silently on the city. Downstairs, people were enjoying Christmas morning. Up here, a dynasty was ending. The first headline hit the digital version of the Aspen Daily an hour later, before most of the socialites had finished their first cup of coffee. Aspen matriarch Eleanor Vance stripped granddaughter of inheritance, then humiliated her in viral video. The story spread fast, the video link circulating through the highest echelons of the community. Eleanor's perfect image, the one she had spent decades cultivating as the epitome of grace and virtue, was in ruins. I watched the initial reports, the cold, clear peace settling over me. The Vance name, the one she had promised would erase me, was now a lightning rod for public condemnation. It was no longer a shield. The fuse was lit. All I had to do now was watch the perfect world she'd built start to burn. The public immolation was swift, brutal, and utterly satisfying. Within 36 hours of hitting send, my engineered crisis had reached a critical mass. The story wasn't just in the local Aspen papers. It was picked up by national gossip columns and social blogs, the places Eleanor truly cared about. Headlines screamed about the heartless matriarch and the Vance family shame. The video of June's broken confession, amplified by the stark contrast of the legal document, went beyond viral. It became a public spectacle, the kind that money and power couldn't buy their way out of. Eleanor Vance, the undisputed queen of Aspen's charity circuit, was a global spectacle of cruelty. I spent Christmas Day and the day after fielding calls from my partner, who was both terrified and exhilarated. The power collapse began immediately. The phones at the Aspen Charitable Trust were melting down. Donors were withdrawing commitments, demanding explanations for how a woman with such an obvious moral deficit could have chaired a foundation built on integrity. The Board of Governors, facing a catastrophic PR nightmare and the sudden loss of millions in pledged funds, convened an emergency meeting on Boxing Day. I didn't need to be there to hear the verdict. Within hours the news hit, the board had demanded Eleanor's immediate resignation. Her decades-long reign of social power, the very pedestal she used to preach her conditional values, crumbled in one swift, merciless fall. She was stripped of her title, her position, and her public face. The shield was gone. Then came the collateral damage, starting with Marcus's breakdown. His call was not a plea for reconciliation, it was hysterical, selfish panic. "Emily, what have you done? My firm, my clients are asking questions. Do you have any idea what this does to my standing?" To the Vance name. He was prioritizing his professional reputation, built on the illusion of a perfect ethical family, over the moral violation committed against his niece. I listened to his frantic voice, the sound of the golden boy finally facing a consequence he couldn't charm his way out of. I kept my voice dangerously calm. "Marcus, your standing is not my problem. Your complicity in signing those documents and your silence when June was hurt, that is what's damaging you, not me." I planted the seed of doubt, forcing him to acknowledge the moral compromise he had made, a moral debt far greater than any financial loss. I hung up before he could launch into another self-pitying tirade. The cracks were spreading. George's redemption came later that day. His voice on the phone was heavy, quiet, and rough, the sound of decades of passive silence finally breaking. "Dorinda," he started, then corrected himself immediately. "Emily, I should have protected you and June. I was weak. I let her do it to keep the peace, and I won't stay silent again." He offered no defense for Eleanor, only a raw, sorrowful apology for his lifetime of passive enabling. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, but a cold respect for a man finally owning his failure. He then offered the vital piece of information I needed for the legal fight, a key meeting Eleanor had held with her lawyers, not just to sign the codicil, but to secure Marcus's compliance on a different, smaller asset transfer that was legally murky. This information proved Eleanor's premeditation extended over years, bolstering my claim of undue influence. He was finally stepping out from under her shadow, a tiny, necessary act of courage. The legal countermove was swift. Eleanor, furious and wounded, hired a ruthless, expensive defense firm to fight back. They launched an immediate PR campaign attempting to paint me as a disgruntled, opportunistic daughter, seeking an undeserved payout. I didn't flinch. I had already achieved my primary goal. I had stripped Eleanor of her social standing and her emotional leverage. She was forced to fight the battle on my terms in the courtroom, where facts, not reputation, were sovereign. The escalation continued. We filed the formal lawsuit contesting the codicil based on undue influence and financial duress, now backed by George's information. My legal firm used the massive public fallout to their advantage, ensuring every motion filed and every piece of evidence submitted was done with maximum transparency to keep the pressure on Eleanor. She was used to controlling the narrative. Now every single one of her moves was under intense public and legal scrutiny. The fractured family was evident in the next exchange with Marcus. His lawyer reached out, demanding mediation, desperate to settle before discovery opened his role to public view. I knew I had him cornered, his ambition a fatal flaw. The situation was now completely flipped. Eleanor, the master manipulator, was reduced to a pariah forced to pay exorbitant legal fees to defend a moral position she had already lost in the court of public opinion. I, the shameful single mother, was the one holding the legal and moral high ground backed by a wave of public support. I looked at the notes from George, the quiet confession, and the memory of June's tears. I didn't feel hatred anymore, just a clear, cold resolve. I hadn't just won a fight against cruelty. I had fractured an entire system of dysfunction and entitlement, proving that American values like self-reliance and moral clarity could in the end dismantle even the most entrenched toxic forms of inherited privilege. The final phase was clear. I had forced her to the table. Now I would secure the future she had tried to steal. The real legal war for the money and final closure was about to begin, but the victory for my dignity had already been won. I realized I didn't just win a fight. I fractured an entire system of dysfunction. But the real legal war for the money and final closure is about to begin. The initial explosive chaos of the public fallout gave way to the grinding, tense reality of mediation. Eleanor's lawyers, recognizing their position was morally and reputationally indefensible, were desperate to settle before a full discovery process could further expose the fraud, especially Marcus's involvement. This was the moment of capitulation, and I felt zero pity. I was driven solely by my definition of justice as restoration. The mediation sessions were brutal, lasting 3 days in a sterile, silent conference room. Eleanor refused to attend, communicating only through her terrified counsel. My team, led by my partner, was relentless, but I handled the personal arguments. I didn't yell. I spoke with the calm, focused clarity of a lawyer holding an ace. The final settlement terms were drafted based on non-negotiable demands. I didn't want the whole estate, only what was fair and, more importantly, what secured June's future. The agreement stipulated the immediate transfer of a significant equitable portion of the liquid assets into a blind trust established solely for June, guaranteeing her education and financial security. A smaller but sufficient sum was allocated to me, covering all my legal fees and compensating me for the years of emotional distress. Crucially, I demanded a clause mandating a very specific publicly filed statement acknowledging that the codicil was revised due to family differences that caused irreparable harm, a quiet win for the public narrative that affirmed my moral stand without opening the door to further litigation. But the most critical part of the settlement involved Marcus. I knew I held the ultimate power, the digital recording from Chloe proving both Eleanor's malice and Marcus's active role in the fraud. Using that evidence publicly would mean total destruction for him. His career would end, and he would face crippling litigation. I wrestled with the moral dilemma. Was justice the total annihilation of every person who wronged me, or was it the restoration of my own family's honor and security? I looked back at June's face, not in tears, but in the peaceful sleep I'd seen in the hotel room. My victory should not replicate Eleanor's cruelty. My goal was to set a boundary, not to wage a war of vengeance. I made the decision during a private recess, informing my partner of my choice to use the confession strategically. I had my lawyers present the transcript of the confession, the absolute evidence of fraud, to Eleanor's lead counsel, but in confidence. The message was clear. This evidence exists. We can and will use it if the settlement is jeopardized, but we will keep it private as long as Eleanor agrees to the full terms and leaves Marcus to his own fate. My silence was the final devastating act of control. I chose to use the confession as leverage, securing my victory, rather than using it as a public execution weapon. I made sure to add a confidential amendment to the settlement that I would keep the evidence private, but only as long as Marcus never again attempted to contact or interfere with June or me. This was the moral boundary I set. My lawyers communicated to Marcus's team that I expected him in turn to honor his financial and moral obligation to care for Chloe and his children, freeing him from Eleanor's continued control. After the documents were signed, my signature firm and final, Eleanor's, a shaky line executed remotely, I felt a profound cleansing stillness. The war was over. I had won my dignity and financial security while maintaining the moral high ground. The focus shifted immediately to healing the core wound, June. We went home to Denver, leaving the toxicity of Aspen behind. June was still processing the pain, but now saw her mother as a powerful, righteous defender. One Saturday morning, she took the wooden beads she had been clutching that awful night, along with the velvet ribbon, and spread them across the kitchen table. With quiet, steady focus, she began to craft something new. She wasn't making a gift for anyone else this time. She took the beads and threaded them onto a durable cord, fashioning a bracelet just for herself. She didn't look up until it was finished. When she did, her eyes were clear and steady. She slipped the bracelet onto her own wrist, the small wooden spheres a testament to her strength. "I don't need Grandma's love, Mom," she said, her voice full of quiet certainty. "I have my own worth." The words struck me with the force of a revelation. This was the cathartic release I'd been fighting for. June wasn't waiting for external validation or bending herself to fit someone else's measure of value. She was claiming it for herself. This marked June's internal shift, the healing of the core wound that Eleanor had inflicted. The final act of quiet exit was the closing of the file. I accepted the settlement check, closed the file on the Vance litigation, and officially broke all contact with Eleanor. There was no triumphant call, no final message. I realized that true power wasn't in the vengeance or the money, but in the clarity of knowing when to walk away completely. I had won the restoration of my family's honor and the security of my daughter's spirit. I had chosen unconditional love and personal truth over the conditional approval of the Vance dynasty. The moral boundary was set, the price was paid, and we were free. With the final settlement documents filed and the bank wire confirmed, the intense adrenaline that had fueled me for months finally began to recede, leaving behind a clear, quiet exhaustion. The focus immediately shifted from fighting a legal war to rebuilding the foundation of my life and career. The professional triumph was unexpected. The public scandal that had engulfed Eleanor paradoxically elevated my own professional standing. I wasn't seen as a bitter, opportunistic daughter. I was seen as the lawyer who had fought for moral truth against entrenched power. My commitment to resilience and justice, showcased in the most public way possible, resonated deeply. My firm was suddenly flooded with clients, ordinary families, fighting abuse of power just like I had. I became an unlikely advocate, a symbol of the American ideal that hard work and moral clarity could prevail over inherited privilege. This new purpose wasn't just lucrative, it was profoundly affirming, giving me an external validation that had nothing to do with the Vance name. I used the settlement money with surgical care. I didn't purchase anything extravagant or ostentatious. I purchased security. I found a charming, modest house in a vibrant Denver neighborhood, a place with a big yard and a sense of genuine community. This was the antithesis of the cold-guarded Vance estate. My new home wasn't a show of wealth. It was a sanctuary, a physical manifestation of the freedom I had fought for. It was a space where June could run free, and where our life was defined by comfort, laughter, and the values we chose, not the values imposed upon us. The move was a symbolic severance from the toxic legacy, planting our flag firmly in the soil of our self-made life. The dynamics with my family were slowly, awkwardly adjusting. Marcus's humiliation and growth was a long, painful process that I witnessed only from a distance through Chloe and the occasional terse email. He faced financial struggles. The settlement cut deeply into his expected inheritance, forcing him for the first time to succeed without his mother's safety net. His firm faced scrutiny, and his pride was shattered. Yet this painful dismantling seemed to be the catalyst he needed. He was forced to focus on the things that truly mattered: his marriage and his children. He began to find genuine common ground with Chloe, who, now free of Eleanor's oppression, was thriving. He was learning what it meant to earn respect, not inherit it, proving that sometimes the dismantling of a corrupt system benefits everyone trapped within it. The most difficult yet necessary exchange came with George's visit. He drove to Denver 6 months after the settlement without telling Eleanor and without any fanfare. I met him on the front porch of my new house. He didn't bring money or gifts, only a raw, sorrowful apology and the visible weight of a lifetime of passive failure. He apologized for his silence, his weakness, and his inability to protect me and June. I listened, my heart hard, but not cold. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only for the chance to build a relationship with June based on unconditional affection. I saw a man genuinely trying to own his past and choose a better future. His apology was accepted not as full forgiveness, but as recognition of a man finally owning his failure and choosing to fight for a moral truth. I allowed him to see June on the condition that he never once mentioned the past or Eleanor. The weight of my father's lifelong silence was finally lifted, granting me a different kind of freedom. The culmination of this section was the slow, steady affirmation of my new reality. I was building a legacy of purpose, not just wealth. My life was defined by agency and emotional clarity. I didn't need the Vance name. I had Emily Taylor, the lawyer, the mother, the survivor. The greatest lesson was not revenge, but the resilience to define my own freedom. I was stronger, clearer, and infinitely happier. I had won the battle, and now I was winning the war of attrition against the toxicity of my past. The fight had sharpened me, allowing me to fully embrace the principles of personal freedom and self-determination that had driven me all along. The wounds were no longer raw. They were healing into scars that reminded me of my strength. 6 months later. The Aspen scandal had long faded from the headlines, replaced by the next social drama. The raw edges of that terrible Christmas were finally smooth-polished by time and hard-won peace. Eleanor Vance was living in the kind of relative isolation that to her felt like total exile. Stripped of her foundation chair, her social calendar, and her public influence, she was forced to confront a life defined by her own bitter company. The Vance estate, that granite monument to conditional love, had been sold to an anonymous overseas corporation. I had been busy building a monument of a different kind, a life defined by purpose and unconditional love. June and I were celebrating Christmas morning in our new home, a modest, charming bungalow with wide windows and a massive backyard, perfect for a growing girl. The air smelled of pine and cinnamon, authentic, earned holiday cheer. The atmosphere was the antithesis of the cold, Vance opulence. It was warm, secure, and loud with laughter. There was no pretense, no performance. I realized I finally had. The Christmas June had longed for, defined not by glittering perfection, but by genuine community and comfort. The only remaining thread to the past came 2 weeks later. A crisp, cream-colored envelope arrived via certified mail from Eleanor's attorney. I recognized the expensive stationery. It wasn't a threat or a lawsuit. It was a single typed page signed by Eleanor herself. It wasn't an apology either. It was a grudging, resentful acknowledgement that I had built something she could not break, a concession that my single-minded determination had outmatched her dynastic planning. She didn't admit remorse, but she admitted defeat. I read the letter, understood the profound shift in power it represented, and without a word walked it over to the fireplace. I watched the expensive paper curl, blacken, and turn to ash. The chapter was closed. I was free of her toxicity forever. Our final symbolic act happened on a cold Saturday afternoon. June and I drove up to Aspen not to see family but to secure our closure. The Vance estate was barely recognizable. Construction crews were already tearing out the custom woodwork and redesigning the landscaping. It was a sterile, transitional place. We walked up to the iron gate, now guarded by a temporary fence. June didn't look sad. She looked resolved. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, smooth river stone she had polished. On it, she had etched one single clear word, worth. She placed the stone on the base of the gate post, right in the freshly laid mulch of the garden where Eleanor had once dismissed her. It was a final marker, not a memorial, a declaration that her value wasn't something to be earned from that place, but something she possessed. We drove away without looking back. June was comfortable asking about college applications and her soccer team. I realized the true victory wasn't the settlement check or even the humiliation of Eleanor. It was the complete and total protection of June's spirit. She had walked through fire, and the experience hadn't scarred her. It had hardened her core with an unbreakable sense of self-determination. My final reflection on the journey was one of profound triumph and catharsis. The fight for the inheritance had stripped away the illusions of my past and sharpened the edges of my future. I was no longer defined by vulnerability. I had found agency in my profession, clarity in my moral choices, and empowerment in my ability to defend the one person who mattered. My journey had been a harsh lesson in the true meaning of resilience, the ability to not only survive the attack, but to use the attack as fuel to build a better life. I hadn't inherited power, I had earned it. Now I was sitting on my porch swing, watching the sun descend over the Denver skyline, the peaks of the Rockies visible in the distance. June was next to me, her new bracelet catching the evening light. She was content, secure, and truly free. I closed the narrative in my mind, understanding the final truth of the Taylor reckoning. Eleanor Vance had tried to define my daughter's worth with a cruel word and a stack of papers. She failed. We had walked through fire, and the only thing that burned away was the lie. We didn't need a legacy. We built a life, and that was the greatest inheritance of all. And with that final act of courage, Emily Taylor and her daughter June closed the toxic chapter on the Vance dynasty, finally building a life defined by their own unwavering worth. If this story of betrayal and triumph resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more deeply emotional tales. We read every single comment of your thoughts on Emily's ultimate revenge and healing. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Yesterday. We'll see you next time.